On April 7, 1803, the bodies were still being counted in Syria. French officers moved through the corridors of a military hospital in Jaffa where men who had survived Turkish blades and desert fever now lay in neat rows on canvas beds. These were not Turkish prisoners. They were French soldiers, Napoleon Bonaparte's own troops. Young men from Marseille and Lyon and Paris, who had followed their general across the Mediterranean, believing in glory and revolution and the march of history. The officers carried written orders. The orders were clear. The orders were signed. By nightfall, 400 men were dead, not from their wounds, not from disease, from poison administered by French military physicians under direct command. And when the poison proved insufficient, when men thrashed and screamed and refused to die quietly, soldiers used bayonets and musket fire to finish what medicine had begun. This was not combat. This was not collateral damage in the fog of war. This was premeditated killing of France's own wounded, executed by the same republic that had promised liberty, equality, fraternity to all mankind. But Jaffa was not an aberration. It was not a moment of battlefield panic or a rogue commander's excess. It was policy, calculated, deliberate, part of a pattern that stretched from the sandstone hospital of the Middle East to the frozen marshes of Eastern Europe, from the prison islands of the Caribbean to the village churches of Spain. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded these acts, not as a mad tyrant or sadistic monster, but as the most rational man in Europe, as the child of Enlightenment thought, as the heir to revolution, as the general who had studied geometry and read Plutarch and believed in the perfectibility of human systems through reason and will. That is what makes the horror complete. We know Napoleon as the military genius, the lawgiver, the man who modernized Europe and spread revolutionary ideals across a continent trapped in feudalism. We build monuments to him. We study his campaigns in military academies. We name streets and squares and institutions in his honor. But every monument stands on soil that remembers what we choose to forget. That Napoleon's genius extended not just to logistics and artillery placement, but to the efficient elimination of human obstacles, that his rationalism permitted calculations in which human lives appeared only as variables in equations of strategic necessity, that his vision of a unified, enlightened Europe required the subordination of entire populations through methods that would later provide templates for ideologies he never lived to see. This is not a story about whether Napoleon was good or evil. Those categories are too simple, too comfortable. This is a story about what happens when brilliant systems meet human bodies, when revolutionary ideals meet the stubborn resistance of people who do not wish to be liberated, when the machinery of modern state power, perfected and rationalized, turns its full attention to the problem of making certain people disappear. We will examine 5 acts, 5 specific decisions that reveal the infrastructure horror built into the Napoleonic system, not the grand battles, not the glorious campaigns, but the quiet murders, the calculated starvation, the systematic eliminations that happened in the spaces between the victories we remember. These acts were not secret. They were reported in newspapers, documented in official correspondence, witnessed by thousands. Some of Napoleon's own officers protested, some refused orders, some wrote memoirs that carefully detailed what they had seen, hoping future generations would understand what had been done in the name of enlightenment and progress. But history has a way of forgetting what doesn't fit the narrative, of filing away the uncomfortable details, of building statues that face away from the mass graves. The question is not whether these acts occurred. The evidence is overwhelming, documented in archives across Europe, verified by multiple sources, confirmed even by Napoleon's own correspondence. The question is why. We built a civilization that could honor the man who ordered them while simultaneously claiming to have learned the lessons of history. And whether we have learned anything at all. The Egyptian campaign began with promises. In the spring of 1798, Napoleon assembled 38,000 troops and explained that they would bring civilization to the Orient. They would liberate Egypt from Ottoman tyranny. They would discover ancient knowledge. They would establish a French empire that would rival Alexander's march to India. The fleet departed Toulon in May. Napoleon brought not just soldiers but scientists, 167 of them, mathematicians, engineers, chemists, naturalists, artists. The expedition included a printing press with Arabic type, instruments for astronomical observation, equipment for chemical experiments. This was to be conquest as enlightenment, military force in service of human knowledge. The troops did not know that Napoleon had already decided their lives were expendable, that the campaign itself was partly a political maneuver to remove him from Paris, where the Directory feared his growing popularity, that the logistics were deliberately underestimated, that the plans for their return had never been fully developed. They learned soon enough. Egypt taught them that enlightenment and empire were not compatible, that you cannot liberate people at gunpoint, that spreading civilization requires destroying the civilization already present, that the machinery of conquest, once set in motion, develops its own requirements that override all initial principles. By the time Napoleon left Egypt, in August 1799, abandoning his army to eventually surrender to the British, approximately 9,000 French soldiers had died, many from disease, many from combat, but thousands more from something worse, from the systematic logic of campaign management that treated human beings as logistical problems to be solved through the most efficient means available. The horror in Egypt was not a deviation from Napoleon's principle, it was their perfect expression. The army of the Orient landed at Alexandria on July 1, 1798. The city fell in hours. Napoleon immediately issued proclamations in Arabic explaining that the French came as friends, that they respected Islam, that they sought only to overthrow the Mamluk tyrants who had oppressed Egypt for centuries. The proclamations were printed on the Arabic press Napoleon had brought. They quoted the Quran, they praised the Prophet, they promised religious freedom. The same day, Napoleon's troops began systematic looting, not individual soldiers stealing trinkets. Organized requisition of food, water, currency, supplies. French quartermasters moved through Alexandria with lists, confiscating grain, stores that Egyptian families had accumulated for the summer months, taking livestock, emptying wells. The looting was policy. The army had insufficient supplies for an extended campaign. Napoleon had calculated that the expedition would live off the land, that Egypt's agricultural surplus would feed French troops, that the civilian population would accept this as the price of liberation. The civilian population did not accept it. On July 7, the army began marching toward Cairo, 45 miles across desert. In July, the heat exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers wore wool uniforms designed for European campaigns. They carried 60-pound packs. They had been told to expect abundant water along the route. The water did not exist. Villages along the march route had been abandoned. Wells had been filled with stones or poisoned. The Mamluks, retreating before the French advance, had implemented scorched earth tactics. They understood that the French logistical system depended on local resources, that an army moving through desert without water would destroy itself. By the second day, soldiers were drinking from stagnant canals contaminated with human waste. By the third day, men were killing each other over water. By the fourth day, troops were shooting their own officers who tried to maintain march discipline. Napoleon rode at the front of the column, personally navigating by compass, apparently untroubled by the suffering behind him. He later wrote that the march proved the army's discipline and fighting spirit, that troops who could survive such hardship would be invincible in battle. More than 300 men died during the march, another 1,000 collapsed and to be carried by their comrades. The army reached the Nile on July 10 and soldiers broke ranks to throw themselves into the water. Some drowned because they were too weak to swim, others drank until their stomachs ruptured. Napoleon gave them 4 hours to rest. Then he ordered them to prepare for battle. The Mamluks were assembling their forces near Cairo. The decisive engagement was approaching, but something had changed in those 4 days of march. The troops had learned that their general considered their lives to be expendable components of a larger design, that his calculations included acceptable losses, that the revolution's promise of human dignity did not extend to situations where that dignity conflicted with strategic objectives. They were beginning to understand the system they served. The Battle of the Pyramids occurred on July 21. 25,000 French troops faced approximately 40,000 Mamluks and Egyptian forces. Napoleon formed his divisions into massive squares, hollow rectangles of infantry with artillery at the corners. The formation was designed to be impervious to cavalry charges. It worked perfectly. Mamluk horsemen charged repeatedly into the French lines and were slaughtered by coordinated musket volleys and canister shot. By late afternoon, the Egyptian army had collapsed. Estimates suggest 10,000 Egyptian dead against fewer than 300 French casualties. Napoleon presented this as vindication of European military science. Rational organization defeating medieval cavalry. The Enlightenment triumphant over Oriental despotism. He did not mention that the battle plan required French soldiers to stand motionless while cavalry charged them, to maintain formation while watching friends disemboweled by sabers, to execute mechanical firing sequences while stepping over bodies. The psychological training required to transform human beings into components of a military machine capable of such discipline would later be studied and refined by every modern army. The victory gave Napoleon control of Cairo. He established headquarters in a pass and began the process of administering Egypt. He created an Egyptian institute modeled on the French Institute. He gathered the scientists he had brought and assigned them research projects. He issued decrees reorganizing Egyptian tax collection, legal systems, irrigation management. The Egyptian population watched this activity with growing comprehension. The French had not come to liberate. They had come to replace one occupying power with another, to impose European systems on an Islamic society, to extract Egyptian resources for French benefit. Resistance began immediately. On October 21, 1798, Cairo exploded in rebellion. The uprising started in the Al-Azhar Mosque and spread through the old city. Egyptian fighters killed every French soldier they could find. They burned French administrative offices. They attacked the Egyptian Institute and destroyed the scientific instruments. Napoleon's response was immediate and comprehensive. He ordered artillery brought into the city. French gunners fired directly into residential neighborhoods, collapsing buildings onto the families inside. Infantry battalions moved street by street, executing any male found carrying a weapon. Officers were instructed to show no mercy, to make the cost of resistance so horrific that no one would consider rebelling again. The bombardment continued for 3 days. When French troops finally regained control, they found approximately 3,000 Egyptians dead, not combatants. Civilians, men, women, and children who had been in their homes when the artillery fire began. Napoleon ordered the bodies left in the streets for days, as a demonstration, as an educational tool, so that everyone in Cairo would understand what resistance meant. The Al-Azhar Mosque, one of Islam's most sacred institutions, was occupied by French troops. Soldiers stabled horses in the prayer hall, used Qurans as fuel for cooking fires, urinated on the floors where scholars had taught for 1,000 years. This was not the passion of battle. This was policy, designed to break the psychological infrastructure that had supported the rebellion, to demonstrate that nothing was sacred when it opposed French authority, that religious institutions had no special protection when they became sites of resistance. Napoleon's engineers calculated that the desecration would have greater deterrent effect than simple violence, that attacking the sacred would undermine the cultural foundations of resistance more efficiently than attacking the population directly. They were learning to weaponize culture itself. By early 1799, the strategic situation had deteriorated. British naval forces controlled the Mediterranean. The French army was isolated in Egypt with no possibility of reinforcement. Disease was endemic. Plague had appeared in several garrison towns. Ottoman forces were assembling in Syria to retake Egypt. Napoleon decided to strike first. In February, he marched 12,000 troops north into Palestine with the objective of capturing the fortress city of Acre. If Acre fell, he could potentially advance into Syria proper, threaten Constantinople, perhaps force the Ottomans to negotiate. The campaign required speed. The army moved light, carrying minimal supplies, planning to capture Ottoman supply depots along the route. Napoleon calculated they could reach Acre in 2 weeks. The first target was Jaffa. The city occupied a strategic position on the coast. It had a natural harbor. Its warehouses held supplies the army desperately needed. Capturing Jaffa would provide a base for the advance on Acre. Ottoman forces had garrisoned Jaffa with approximately 4,000 troops. Many were Albanians and Maghrebis who had served in Egypt and had been captured during Napoleon's campaigns, then released on promise they would not fight France again. When Napoleon discovered these troops now defended Jaffa, he understood their presence as a personal betrayal, as a violation of terms he had offered in good faith. His response would demonstrate what betrayal cost. The siege began on March 3, 1799. French artillery breached the walls in 4 days. On March 7, infantry stormed through the gaps. What happened next depends on which sources you credit, but the fundamental facts are not disputed. French troops were ordered to take the city by assault. In military terminology, this meant no quarter. Any defender who resisted would be killed. Surrender would not be accepted once the assault began. The order was clear. The order was documented. The order came from Napoleon. By nightfall, French soldiers controlled Jaffa. They had killed approximately 2,000 Ottoman defenders in house-to-house fighting. But another 2,000 had retreated to a citadel inside the city and were attempting to negotiate surrender. Napoleon faced a logistical problem. He could not spare troops to guard 2,000 prisoners. He could not release them. They had already violated one promise not to fight. He could not take them with the army as it advanced. He could not leave them in Jaffa, where they might retake the city after the French departed. His solution was efficient. On March 10, French soldiers marched the prisoners to the beach. The prisoners were told they would be executed. They were formed in groups, and then systematically over Acre. In course of several hours, French infantry shot them all, not in battle, not in the heat of combat, but in organized groups, after the fighting had ended, after they had surrendered, after they had been promised their lives would be spared if they laid down weapons. The executions were witnessed by French officers who later testified to what they saw. Some protested. General Berthier argued that mass execution of prisoners violated military honor. General Murat suggested keeping them alive as bargaining tools. Napoleon overruled all objections. The executions would proceed. The army could not afford the luxury of following conventional military ethic. Later accounts suggest the method of execution evolved during the day. Initially, prisoners were shot by firing squad, but this consumed too much ammunition, so soldiers switched to bayonets. When that proved too slow, some prisoners were forced into the sea and shot as they attempted to swim. Others were drowned by soldiers who waded into the water and held them under. The precise details vary across sources. What does not vary is the outcome. By evening, approximately 2,000 prisoners were dead on the beach at Jaffa, and Napoleon's army had learned that their general's strategic calculations now included industrial-scale killing of prisoners of war as an acceptable logistical solution. But the horror at Jaffa had only begun. Among the French troops who entered Jaffa were men who had fought through the siege, or had seen friends killed in the street fighting, who had been told the city would be theirs to plunder as reward for the assault. The plunder began immediately, not organized requisition, but individual looting. Soldiers broke into homes, warehouses, mosques. They took money, jewelry, fabric, food. They raped women. They killed men who tried to protect their families. They burned buildings to cover evidence of theft. French officers made minimal effort to stop the looting. Napoleon had calculated that allowing the sack would maintain morale, that soldiers who felt rewarded would fight harder in future engagements. The implicit permission would increase unit cohesion through shared transgression. The looting continued for 3 days. During that time, French soldiers entered buildings throughout Jaffa, including buildings where Ottoman soldiers had died during the fighting, buildings where bodies were decomposing in the March heat. Plague had been present in Jaffa before the French arrived. The disease was endemic to the region. Ottoman authorities had attempted to quarantine infected areas, but the siege had disrupted public health measures. When French soldiers entered infected buildings searching for loot, for hiding defenders, for anything valuable, they were exposed. The mechanism of plague transmission was not understood in 1799. Soldiers did not know that the fleas on corpses could carry Yersinia pestis, did not know that looting bodies was epidemiologically catastrophic. Within a week, French soldiers began showing symptoms: fever, swelling of lymph nodes in the groin and armpits, blackening of extremities as blood vessels shut down, delirium, death. Plague moves through an army faster than through a civilian population. Soldiers live in close quarters, share bedding, eat from common pots, drink from the same water sources. The conditions of military encampment are optimal for disease transmission. By March 20, dozens of soldiers were sick. By March 25, hundreds. The army's medical staff had no effective treatment. They could isolate victims. They could administer laudanum for pain. They could pray, but they could not stop the disease. Napoleon faced a second logistical problem. The army was preparing to march on Acre. Speed was essential. Every day of delay allowed the Ottomans to reinforce the fortress, but hundreds of soldiers were too sick to march. They could not walk, could not carry equipment, could barely breathe. Conventional military practice was clear. An army preparing to march would establish a garrison hospital in captured territory, leave medical staff and guards to care for the sick, return for them after the campaign concluded. But Napoleon had insufficient troops to garrison Jaffa, and leaving sick soldiers behind meant they would be captured when Ottoman forces inevitably retook the city. Everyone knew what happened to captured soldiers, especially soldiers weakened by disease, especially in a city where French troops had massacred 2,000 prisoners and spent 3 days raping and looting. Napoleon's physicians made a proposal. They could not cure plague, but they could end suffering. Laudanum in sufficient doses was fatal. Administered to dying men, it would appear to be pain management. The men would slip into unconsciousness and simply not wake up. It would be mercy. It would be kindness. It would solve the logistical problem of immobile soldiers while avoiding the horror of abandoning them to torture and execution. The proposal was rational. It was efficient. It was humane by certain definitions of humanity. Napoleon approved it. On March 28, French military physicians began administering fatal doses of opium tincture to plague victims in Jaffa's military hospitals. The exact number killed this way remains disputed. Some sources suggest several dozen. Others claim several hundred. The documentation was deliberately destroyed or obscured. What is certain is that Napoleon gave explicit orders that no sick soldier who could not march should be left alive in Jaffa, and that French physicians trained in the rational medicine of the Enlightenment executed those orders, but the doses were imprecise. Opium tinctures varied in strength. Physicians were estimating lethal amounts based on theory rather than experience, and some men did not die when they were supposed to. This created a third problem. Soldiers who had been poisoned but survived, who were conscious when the medical staff left, who understood what had been done to them. The accounts of what happened next come from multiple sources and are remarkably consistent. When French troops departed Jaffa, physicians reported that some poisoned soldiers remained alive. Napoleon gave orders that no witnesses could be left behind. Infantry detachments entered the hospitals a final time, and soldiers used bayonets to kill the men who had survived the poison. The killing were witnessed by local residents who had been pressed into service burying bodies, by Arab guides attached to the French expedition, by French officers who later wrote memoirs documenting what they had seen. One physician, René Nicolas Desganettes, refused to participate in the poisonings. He later testified that he told Napoleon directly that he would not kill his patients. Napoleon reportedly replied that Desganettes was too sentimental, that war required difficult decisions, that the physician's Hippocratic oath did not supersede military necessity. Desganettes survived to document the exchange, but many physicians who participated in the poisonings also survived, returned to France, resumed medical practice, treated civilian patients, trained the next generation of doctors, apparently untroubled by what they had done in Jaffa. The infrastructure of medicalized killing, the transformation of healing professionals into executioners through appeals to efficiency, mercy would be refined over the next century until it reached its full expression in the hospitals of the Third Reich. But the foundation was laid on March 28, 1799, when French physicians accepted the proposition that some lives were not worth the logistical burden of saving. Napoleon left Jaffa with his army intact and mobile. The march to Acre proceeded on schedule. The plague victims who could not walk had been eliminated as a logistical problem, and European medicine had learned a new skill. The siege of Acre failed. British ships reinforced the fortress. Ottoman forces held the walls. After 2 months of assault, Napoleon withdrew. The Syrian campaign collapsed. The army retreated to Egypt in disarray, having lost a quarter of its strength to combat disease and desertion. But Napoleon returned to France in August 1799 and presented the Egyptian expedition as a triumph. He distributed published accounts emphasizing scientific achievements, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, advances in understanding Egyptian antiquities, the establishment of the Institut d'Egypte, French newspapers printed stories of glorious battles and enlightened administration. Artists created paintings showing Napoleon among the pyramids, bringing civilization to grateful natives. The narrative of the campaign was carefully controlled to emphasize glory and minimize horror. Jaffa was mentioned in official accounts, but the execution of prisoners was described as a regrettable necessity forced on Napoleon by Ottoman treachery. The poisoning of plague victims was not mentioned at all, or when it was mentioned was presented as an act of mercy toward dying men. The control of narrative was so successful that within a decade, Jaffa appeared in French popular culture not as a site of atrocity, but as an example of Napoleon's military genius, of his ability to make difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. The pattern would repeat throughout Napoleon's career. Each atrocity would be followed by careful narrative management, official accounts that emphasized necessity, unofficial whispers about regrettable circumstances, public amnesia that allowed France to celebrate victories without examining their cost. But the officers who had been at Jaffa remembered. They carried the knowledge of what they had witnessed, and some of them would be present for what came next. The pattern of the Egyptian campaign, brilliant strategy producing tactical victories that concealed human catastrophe, would define Napoleon's approach to military operations for the next 15 years. The willingness to calculate acceptable losses, the subordination of individual lives to strategic objectives, the use of medical and logistical systems to eliminate problems more efficiently than conventional violence. But Egypt also revealed something else, that Napoleon's genius included an intuitive understanding of how to make atrocity acceptable, how to present mass killing as regrettable necessity, how to transform war crimes into administrative challenges, how to build systems that distributed moral responsibility so widely that no individual felt fully accountable. This was not the work of a monster. Monsters do not build efficient systems. They indulge in cruelty for its own sake. They revel in suffering. Napoleon built systems that eliminated suffering from view, that reduced human beings to logistical variables, that allowed educated, enlightened men to participate in industrial-scale killing while maintaining their self-conception as civilized and rational. This was the true horror. Not that atrocity has always occurred in war, but that Napoleon perfected methods for making atrocity routine, for bureaucratizing murder, for creating administrative structures that could process human elimination as efficiently as they processed military supply chains. And every officer who served under Napoleon learned these methods, carried them to future posts, applied them in new contexts, taught them to subordinates. The infrastructure of rationalized mass killing, developed in the sands of Egypt and the hospitals of Jaffa, would metastasize across Europe over the next 15 years. But first, Napoleon needed to consolidate power in France, and that required eliminating a different kind of obstacle. When Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, France was exhausted by a decade of revolution. The initial euphoria of 1789 had given way to terror, war, economic collapse, and deep political chaos. The French people wanted stability, they wanted order, they wanted someone strong enough to end the constant upheaval. Napoleon provided that strength. He presented himself as the heir to revolutionary principles, but also as the man who could control revolutionary excess, who could preserve the gains of the revolution while preventing further chaos. The Constitution of Year 8, enacted in December 1799, made Napoleon first consul with near dictatorial powers. He could propose legislation, appoint ministers, command the military, control foreign policy. The legislature became largely ceremonial, but regional resistance remained, particularly in western France, where Catholic and royalist population had resisted republican authority since 1793. The Vendée region had experienced a brutal civil war. Brittany harbored Chouan rebels who continued guerrilla operations against government forces. Napoleon's strategy for pacification combined political conciliation with military elimination. He negotiated with moderate royalists, restored some Catholic institutions, offered amnesty to rebels who surrendered, but for those who continued resistance, he developed more permanent solutions. The Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue presented Napoleon with his most complex challenge. The island had been France's wealthiest colony, producing sugar and coffee through slave labor. But in 1791, enslaved people had rebelled. By 1799, they had largely won. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a former slave-turned-brilliant general, Saint-Domingue had established de facto independence. Louverture governed the island, controlled the economy, commanded an army of battle-hardened former slaves. He maintained nominal allegiance to France but operated with complete autonomy. Napoleon found this situation intolerable, not primarily because of racial ideology, though he shared the casual racism of his era, but because autonomous colonies contradicted his vision of centralized imperial control. Because Saint-Domingue's example threatened to inspire slave rebellions throughout the Caribbean. Because France needed colonial wealth to finance European ambitions. In 1801, Napoleon dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with 20,000 troops to retake Saint-Domingue. The official objective was to restore French authority while respecting the abolition of slavery that the Revolution had decreed in 1794. The actual objective, revealed in Napoleon's private correspondence to Leclerc, was to reimpose slavery and eliminate the leadership of the black population that had defeated French force previously. The invasion began in February 1802. French troops landed at multiple points and advanced rapidly. Louverture's forces fought skillful defensive campaigns but were gradually overwhelmed by European reinforcement and superior artillery. By May, Louverture had agreed to surrender in exchange for guarantees of safety for his officers and preservation of freedom for the formerly enslaved population. Napoleon had other plans. The letters Napoleon sent to Leclerc during 1802 reveal the systematic nature of his approach. They are preserved in French military archives. They are written in Napoleon's characteristic style, clear, concise, focused on practical implementation. They order the elimination of black military leadership through any means necessary. They specify that Louverture and his generals should be arrested on false pretenses and deported to France. They explain that once leadership is removed, the broader population can be controlled through targeted violence and fear. They reinstate slavery explicitly, despite revolutionary decrees. And they introduce a new category of administrative killing, not execution of military enemies, not even elimination of prisoners, but the systematic targeting of an entire population category for removal. Leclerc followed instructions precisely. In June 1802, Louverture was invited to a negotiation. He was arrested, placed on a ship, and deported to France. He died in a fortress prison in the Jura Mountains in April 1803, officially from pneumonia, though the circumstances of his imprisonment suggest deliberate neglect designed to ensure he would not survive. With Louverture removed, Leclerc began implementing the second phase, the arrest and execution of black officers who had served in Louverture's army, the disarmament of the formerly enslaved population, the re-establishment of plantation discipline. But the population of Saint-Domingue understood what was happening. They had fought too hard for freedom to surrender it quietly. Resistance reignited across the island. Leclerc responded with systematic terror. French troops burned villages suspected of harboring rebels. They executed civilians found with weapons. They hunted resistance fighters through the mountains with tracking dogs, specially imported from Cuba. The dogs were a calculated innovation. French military planners recognized that conventional troops could not effectively pursue guerrilla forces through tropical terrain, but dogs bred for tracking runaway slaves could. The same animals that had been used for plantation discipline could be repurposed for counterinsurgency. Accounts from French officers describe organized hunts, dogs tearing apart captured rebels while soldiers watched. The use of dog attacks as public spectacle to terrorize civilian population. The bodies left displayed as warnings. This was not the passion of soldiers in combat. This was systematic application of terror as a governance tool. The transformation of plantation discipline into military counterinsurgency technique. Napoleon approved these methods explicitly. His correspondence with Leclerc discusses the utility of fear in controlling degenerate population, the need to make examples so horrific that further resistance would appear suicidal. But disease intervened where morality did not. Yellow fever swept through French forces in the summer of 1802. Soldiers who had survived European campaigns died by the thousands in Caribbean heat. Leclerc himself contracted the disease and died in November 1802. His replacement, General Rochambeau, escalated the terror. He brought more dogs from Cuba. He implemented drownings of captured rebels, loading prisoners onto ships, sailing into deep water, and throwing them overboard in chains. He experimented with sulfur gas as a method of mass execution. pumping the gas into ship holds where prisoners had been confined. The gas experiments were documented in letters between French officers. They discussed the practical challenges of gas deployment, the difficulty of sealing ship holds adequately, the time required for victims to die, the disposal of bodies. These discussions occurred in 1803. They were written by educated French officers. They were sent through official military postal channels. They were filed in archives where they remained for historians to discover the infrastructure of gas. As an execution method, the logistical discussions of efficiency and deployment appeared first not in the concentration camps of the 20th century, but in the Caribbean correspondence of Napoleonic officers experimenting with cost-effective ways to kill prisoners in bulk. But the campaign failed regardless. Yellow fever continued killing French troops faster than they could be replaced. The formerly enslaved population fought with desperate fury, knowing that defeat meant re-enslavement or death. By 1803, French forces controlled only coastal enclaves. In November 1803, the remnants of the French army evacuated Saint-Domingue. On January 1, 1804, Haiti declared independence. It became the first nation established by formerly enslaved people, the only successful slave rebellion in history. Napoleon's response was to ban Haitian ships from French ports, to refuse diplomatic recognition, to support economic sanctions intended to ensure Haiti's failure, to establish a policy of isolation that would continue for decades and contribute to Haiti's underdevelopment. He could not accept that formerly enslaved people had defeated European armies, could not acknowledge that his systematic application of terror had been insufficient, could not allow Haiti's example to inspire other colonized populations. So he attempted to erase Haiti from the map of legitimate nations, to make it a non-place, to demonstrate that successful resistance to European imperial power would result in total exclusion from the international system. The erasure was less complete than the physical elimination attempted in 1802 to 1803, but it was more durable. Haiti's isolation continued long after Napoleon's death, long after slavery's abolition. The international community's refusal to accept Haiti as a legitimate nation rooted in Napoleon's initial policy contributed to economic and political catastrophes that continue today. This was Napoleon's genius. When direct violence failed, he built systems of exclusion that could achieve elimination through administrative means, that could make populations disappear not through killing but through organized forgetting. But some witnesses refused to forget. French officers who survived Saint-Domingue brought back knowledge, not just of yellow fever and tropical warfare, but of techniques for population control through industrialized terror, of the utility of dogs as weapons, of the potential of chemical agents for mass execution, of the psychological impact of making violence into public spectacle. These officers took positions throughout Napoleon's expanding empire. They commanded garrisons in occupied territories. They trained new officers. They implemented pacification campaigns in Spain, Italy, Germany, and they carried with them the understanding that civilian populations could be managed through systematic terror, that resistance could be broken through calculated atrocity, that the infrastructure of modern state administration could be adapted to the purpose of making troublesome people disappear. This knowledge transferred the circulation of terror techniques through the professional officer class was perhaps more consequential than any specific atrocity. It meant that each new occupation could benefit from lessons learned in previous campaigns, that mistakes would not be repeated, that the machinery of elimination would become more efficient. With practice, Spain would provide the testing ground for full implementation. In 1808, Napoleon decided to occupy Spain. The official justification was that the Spanish monarchy was incompetent and corrupt, that Spain needed French administration to modernize, that the occupation would be temporary just until proper governance could be established. The actual reason was strategic. Napoleon wanted control of the Iberian Peninsula to enforce his continental system, the economic blockade of Britain. He wanted access to Spanish resources. He wanted to eliminate the possibility of British forces using Spain as a base for operations against France. The occupation began in May 1808 when Napoleon forced the Spanish king to abdicate and installed his own brother Joseph as king of Spain. French troops entered Madrid expecting minimal resistance. They believed Spanish people would welcome liberation. Roman ineffective monarchy. The Spanish people had different views. On May 2, 1808, Madrid erupted in spontaneous rebellion. Civilians attacked French soldiers with whatever weapons they could find: kitchen knives, roof tiles, boiling water. The uprising was chaotic, disorganized, and completely unexpected by French commanders. The French response was immediate and overwhelming. General Murat, commanding occupation forces in Madrid, ordered his troops to suppress the rebellion with maximum force. Cavalry charged into crowds. Artillery fired into residential neighborhoods. Infantry conducted house-to-house searches, executing any civilian found with weapons. By nightfall, the streets were filled with bodies. Estimates suggest between 400 and 1,000 civilians died in the suppression, but the horror occurred the next day. On May 3, French military courts conducted rapid trials of captured rebels. The trials lasted minutes. Evidence was unnecessary. Anyone identified as a participant in the uprising was sentenced to execution. The executions occurred throughout Madrid. Firing squads shot prisoners against church walls, in public squares, in courtyards. The bodies were left displayed as warnings. The painter Francisco Goya later documented these executions. In the 3rd of May 1808, one of the most powerful anti-war paintings ever created. It shows French soldiers as a faceless firing squad executing Spanish civilians whose faces are individualized and terrifying. Ed. The painting captures the mechanization of killing, the transformation of soldiers into instruments of state violence who need not see the humanity of their targets. But Goya's painting, Create, in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, shows only one execution. The reality was hundreds of executions across the city, throughout the day, with the same mechanical efficiency. French military planners had learned from Egypt and Haiti. They understood that suppressing civilian resistance required making examples so brutal that further rebellion would appear suicidal. That terror had to be public, visible, and comprehensive. The executions in Madrid were designed as pedagogy, as lessons in what happened when civilians challenged French authority. But the lesson the Spanish people learned was different than the one French planners intended. The Madrid uprising sparked resistance across Spain, not organized military opposition. The Spanish army had largely capitulated, but civilian guerrilla warfare. Farmers who ambushed French patrols. Villagers who poisoned French water supplies. Priests who organized local militias. The Spanish called these fighters guerrilleros, little warriors. The term entered European languages as guerrilla, defining a new form of warfare that would shape conflicts for the next 2 centuries. But in 1808, guerrilla warfare was new to French forces. They had fought conventional armies. They understood siege warfare and set-piece battles. They did not understand how to fight enemies who blended into civilian populations, who struck and vanished, who did not wear uniforms or follow military protocols. Napoleon's response was to treat all Spanish civilians as potential combatants, to eliminate the distinction between civilian and military population, to make entire villages responsible for guerrilla attacks that originated in their vicinity. The orders were clear. Villages near ambush sites would be burned. Male populations would be executed. Women and children would be made homeless to deter other communities from harboring guerrillas. This was collective punishment. Not punishing individuals for crimes they committed, but punishing entire populations for crimes some members might have committed, or might commit in future, or might know about but fail to report. The policy was systematic. French columns moving through Spanish territory burned an average of 3 villages per week between 1808 and 1813. The total number of villages destroyed exceeds 1,500. The number of civilians killed is estimated between 200,000 and 300. These numbers are approximate because the killing was diffuse, not concentrated in single events that could be easily documented, but distributed across 5 years and across the entire Spanish landscape. Individual atrocities have been documented by multiple sources. French soldiers shooting village populations assembled in churches, burning families alive in their homes, throwing children down wells, raping women in front of their families before killing them. These acts were not aberrations by rogue soldiers. They followed from Napoleon's explicit policy that villages near guerrilla activity should be eliminated as examples. French officers wrote letters home describing the work. They expressed weariness, complained about the monotony of burning villages, discussed the practical challenges of ensuring thorough destruction, mentioned, almost casually, the number of villagers killed in each operation. The tone of these letters is perhaps most disturbing. They discuss mass killing the way peacetime officers might discuss supply requisitions or training schedules, as tedious but necessary administrative work. As part of the routine duties of occupation, the banality is complete. Atrocity had become bureaucratic procedure, but guerrilla resistance only intensified. Each village destroyed created dozens of new fighters. Each family burned made entire communities permanently hostile to French rule. Each execution produced martyrs whose names spread through oral networks faster than French authorities could suppress them. By 1810, French forces controlled Spanish cities but almost no rural territory. Columns could not move without heavy escorts. Supply convoys were constantly ambushed. Garrisons were isolated and besieged. Napoleon sent more troops. At the campaign's peak, over 300,000 French soldiers occupied Spain, more than he had used to conquer Prussia, Austria, or any other European power, and still they could not pacify the country. The Spanish campaign became a bleeding ulcer that drained French military resources. The troops trapped in Spain could not be deployed for campaigns in Eastern Europe. The constant attrition required continuous reinforcement. The economic cost was staggering, but Napoleon refused to withdraw. Partly from strategic calculation, losing Spain would compromise the continental system. Partly from pride, he could not accept that irregular Spanish fighters could resist the Grande Army that had defeated every professional army in Europe, and partly from systematic logic. Withdrawing would suggest that civilian resistance could defeat modern military occupation, that terror was insufficient for controlling hostile population, that Napoleon's entire approach to governance through fear had failed. So the campaign continued. Villages continued burning. Civilians continued dying. French soldiers continued writing bored letters about the week's killings. Until 1813, when Napoleon needed every soldier to defend France from the coalition assembling after his disaster in Russia. Only then did French forces evacuate Spain, leaving behind the ruin of 1,500 villages and a population that would remember French occupation for generations. The Spanish experience taught European populations what resisting Napoleon actually meant. Not the glorious revolutionary rhetoric, not the promise of enlightened administration, but systematic destruction of communities that refused to accept French authority. And it taught Napoleon's officers that even total war against civilian populations could fail, that burning enough villages would eventually produce an entire nation of guerrillas, that terror, pushed to its logical extreme, could become counterproductive. Some officers learned these lessons. Others concluded that the Spanish campaign had simply not been brutal enough, that more comprehensive methods were required, that the problem was not excessive violence but insufficient violence. Those officers would later serve other regimes, other empires, other systems that needed to eliminate troublesome populations efficiently. The techniques they had refined in Spanish villages would be available when needed. But even before the Spanish campaign reached its conclusion, Napoleon was preparing for his greatest military operation, the invasion of Russia, an enterprise that would demonstrate the full catastrophic potential of his systematic approach to warfare. The Russian campaign would reveal what happened when Napoleonic logistics encountered populations too vast to eliminate, when supply systems optimized for European distances met continental scale, when the machinery of rationalized warfare broke down and soldiers learned that the system viewed them as expendable as the enemies they fought. Russia would be the culmination of everything. Napoleon had learned about managing human lives as logistical variables, and the demonstration of what that approach meant when it failed. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia emerged from the same systematic logic that had driven all his campaigns. Russia's participation in the continental system was half-hearted. Russian ports continued trading with Britain. This undermined Napoleon's grand strategy of strangling British commerce. War, therefore, was necessary. Not to conquer Russia permanently. Napoleon was not insane, but to force Tsar Alexander to honor treaty commitments, to demonstrate that defying French power had consequences. The invasion force Napoleon assembled for this demonstration was the largest army Europe had ever seen. 600,000 troops, soldiers from France, Italy, Poland, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, the full resources of Napoleonic Europe mobilized for a single campaign. The logistics were unprecedented. The army would march over 1,000 miles into Russia. It would need food for 600,000 men and 200,000 horses. ammunition, medical supplies, equipment. All of this would have to be transported across terrible roads through hostile territory. Napoleon's staff spent months planning supply chains. They established magazines at intervals along the invasion route. They calculated consumption rates. They developed schedules for resupply convoys. They created the most sophisticated military logistics system yet devised. It was completely inadequate. The fundamental problem was that the calculations assumed cooperation from the invaded population, that Russian farmers would sell food to French requisition officers, that Russian infrastructure would support French supply lines, that local resources could supplement transported supplies, but Russian authority implemented the same scorched earth policy the Mamluks had used in Egypt. As French forces advanced, Russian armies retreated, burning crops and villages behind them, poisoning wells, driving livestock east, leaving nothing the French could use. By July 1812, 1 month into the campaign, supply systems were failing. Horses were dying from lack of fodder. Soldiers were marching on half rations. Diseases associated with malnutrition, dysentery, typhus were spreading through the ranks. Napoleon knew his logistics were collapsing. His daily situation reports documented the deteriorating supply situation, but he continued advancing, believing that defeating the Russian army in a decisive battle would force Alexander to negotiate. The decisive battle never came. Russian forces refused to engage on Napoleon's terms. They continued retreating, drawing the French deeper into Russia, further from their supply bases into regions where scorched earth had been most complete. By September, the army reached Moscow. Napoleon expected the Tsar to surrender once the ancient capital fell. But Moscow was empty. The population had evacuated. And on the night the French entered, fires began. The fires were deliberate. Russian authorities had decided that denying Moscow to Napoleon was worth burning their own capital. The fires spread quickly, consuming 3/4 of the city. The supplies Napoleon had counted on, the food stored in Moscow's warehouses, the shelter its buildings would provide, went up in smoke. Napoleon waited in the ruins for weeks, expecting Alexander to negotiate. The negotiations never came. And in October, with winter approaching and supplies nearly exhausted, Napoleon gave the order he had hoped to avoid. The army would retreat. The retreat from Moscow destroyed the Grande Army, not primarily through Russian military action, though Russian forces harassed the retreat constantly, but through the collapse of the logistical system that had kept 600,000 men alive. The planning that had seemed so sophisticated in Paris proved worthless in practice. Supply magazines had been looted or destroyed. Roads had deteriorated. The timetables that governed resupply assumed an intact army moving at predictable speeds, not a desperate retreat by starving men. As the system failed, discipline collapsed. Soldiers abandoned equipment to move faster. They looted Russian villages for food. They fought each other over scraps. Officers lost control of their units. The army fragmented into desperate groups trying to reach safety. And Napoleon, the response to this collapse, revealed the final logic of his system. When the machinery failed, the men became obstacles to be managed rather than soldiers to be saved. The first decision came at the Berezina River in late November. Russian forces had destroyed the bridges. The river was partially frozen, not solid enough to walk across, but frozen enough to make crossing deadly, and Russian armies were closing from multiple directions. French engineers built 2 temporary bridges in 48 hours of desperate work. But the bridges were narrow. Only a few thousand men could cross per hour, and over 100,000 soldiers were trapped on the wrong side of the river, with Russian forces approaching. Napoleon crossed first with his guard. Then the army began crossing in whatever order they could. Officers tried to maintain organization, but desperate soldiers surged toward the bridges regardless of rank or unit. Thousands were crushed in the panic. Thousands more were pushed into the river and drowned. When Russian artillery began firing into the crowds waiting to cross, thousands more died on the riverbank. Napoleon's decision was to save what could be saved. The bridges would remain open as long as possible, but when Russian forces got too close, they would be burned, regardless of how many soldiers remained on the wrong side. On November 29, French engineers set fire to the bridges while thousands of soldiers were still crossing. The men on the bridges died. The men trapped on the far bank were captured or killed by advancing Russian forces. Estimates suggest 20 to 30,000 soldiers were abandoned at the Berezina, not because saving them was impossible, but because doing so would have risked the escape of the troops who had already crossed. The calculation was pure. The army as a whole was more important than any individual component. Some would be sacrificed so others could survive. This was the explicit logic of the system Napoleon had built, and now it was being applied to French soldiers in the same way it had been applied to Egyptian plague victims and Spanish villagers and Haitian rebels. The machinery did not distinguish between friend and enemy when it calculated acceptable losses. But the Berezina was not the worst of the retreat. That came in the final weeks as the army approached the Polish border in December. Winter had arrived in full force. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Soldiers were wearing summer uniforms. The heavy winter clothing that should have been distributed was lost with the supply trains. They had no shelter, no food, no fuel for fires. Men began freezing to death in the night. At first, officers attempted to maintain burial procedures, but there were too many bodies, and the men were too weak to dig graves in frozen ground, so the bodies were left along the roads, in the fields, in villages the army passed through. Thousands of bodies, then tens of thousands, creating a trail of corpses that marked the army's route across Russia and Third. Living became increasingly indistinguishable from the dead. Soldiers developed frostbite and gangrene. Extremities turned black. Men walked until their frozen feet crumbled. They became delirious from hypothermia and wandered away from the columns to die alone in the snow. The army's medical services collapsed completely. Physicians could not help men who were dying from cold and starvation. Hospitals became places where men went to die more slowly than they would have on the road. And Napoleon's orders during this phase are documented in the archives. He instructed his remaining staff to prioritize saving combat-effective units. Any soldier too sick or injured to fight was to be left behind. Medical resources were to be concentrated on troops who could still serve. The orders were rational. An army in retreat cannot spare resources for soldiers who cannot contribute to its defense. Every cart used to transport sick men was a cart that could not transport ammunition or food for healthy soldiers. But the implementation meant that French physicians were making the same calculations they had made at Jaffa, deciding which men would be treated and which would be left to die, transforming medical practice into triage that accepted mass death as administrative necessity. Except in Russia there was no poison to make death quick, just abandonment, leaving sick and injured soldiers by the roadside to freeze, sometimes telling them help would return, sometimes not bothering with the lie. Russian civilians found these abandoned soldiers. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they killed them revenge for what French troops had done during the advance. Sometimes they simply ignored them and let winter complete its work. French officers' accounts describe walking past their own abandoned soldiers, hearing them call for help, continuing forward because stopping would serve no purpose and would slow the column. The psychological mechanism required to keep walking while your own troops beg for help is the same mechanism required to execute prisoners at Jaffa or burn villages in Spain. It requires accepting that individual human lives matter less than the system's continuation, that personal moral responsibility is subordinate to strategic necessity. Napoleon's entire officer class was trained in this mechanism, and in Russia, they applied it to themselves. By December 1812, what remained of the Grande Armée had crossed into Poland. Approximately 40,000 combat-capable troops remained from the 600,000 who had invaded Russia. Another 100,000 or so were still alive, but too sick or injured to fight effectively. The rest were dead, or captured, or had deserted. Nearly 500,000 casualties in 6 months, the worst military disaster in European history to that point. Napoleon left the army on December 5. He traveled quickly to Paris to manage the political situation. He left Marshal Murat in command with instructions to continue the retreat and preserve what could be preserved. The troops learned that their emperor had abandoned them, that he had fled to save his political position while they starved and froze. Some units mutinied, others simply dispersed. The retreat dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Murat eventually abandoned the army too. Officers fled. The chain of command disintegrated. By the time the survivors reached Prussia in early 1813, there was barely an army left to command. The Russian campaign had consumed the Grande Armée, The military machine Napoleon had built over 15 years of constant warfare had destroyed itself through the perfect application of its own logic, because the logic was consistent throughout. From the Egyptian hospitals to the Berezina River, the system operated on the principle that human lives were variables to be optimized in service of strategic objectives, that suffering was regrettable but acceptable when it served necessity, that the machinery's continuation justified any sacrifice demanded from its components. In Russia, the machinery had demanded everything and received it, and still failed. But failure did not produce reflection. Napoleon returned to Paris and immediately began rebuilding the army. He conscripted new troops, ordered new equipment, prepared for the 1813 campaign against the coalition assembling to drive from Germany. The young men drafted in 1813 were barely trained. Many were teenagers. They were sent to replace the veterans who had died in Russia, given uniforms and muskets and orders to march. They fought bravely. They died in enormous numbers. By late 1813, Napoleon had lost another 250,000 casualties in Germany alone, and still the pattern continued. More conscriptions, more campaigns, more losses, until finally the coalition entered France itself in 1814 and forced Napoleon's abdication. He returned briefly in 1815, fought one final campaign, lost at Waterloo, and was exiled permanently to St. Helena, where he died in 1821. The final accounting of Napoleon's wars suggests between 3 and 6 million total deaths. The numbers are imprecise because record-keeping was incomplete and many deaths went undocumented. But the scale is clear. This was not the highest death toll in history, not even the highest death toll in European history. But it represented something new. The application of rational, systematic organization to the prosecution of war, the transformation of military operations into administrative processes that could be optimized for efficiency. Future military planners studied Napoleon's campaigns. They learned his logistics, his organizational innovations, his approach to staff work and command structure. They built on what he had created. They made it more efficient, more comprehensive, more capable of mobilizing entire societies for warfare. And in the 20th century, when those improved systems were applied to industrial-scale conflict, the death tolls reached tens of millions. Because the infrastructure Napoleon had built, the rational administration of mass killing had been perfected beyond anything he imagined. But Napoleon cannot be blamed for what came after. He worked with the technology and organizational capacity of his era. He could not foresee mechanized warfare, or aerial bombardment, or nuclear weapons. What he can be held accountable for is establishing the principle that mass killing could be rationalized through systematic organization, that atrocity could be made routine through bureaucratic procedure, that educated, enlightened men could participate in industrial-scale violence while maintaining their self-conception as civilized and moral. This was Napoleon's true legacy, not the legal code or the administrative reforms or the military victories, but the demonstration that modernity's tools could be applied to elimination as effectively as to construction, that the same rational systems that built hospitals and schools and roads could be adapted to process human beings toward death with industrial efficiency. That enlightenment and atrocity were not opposites but could be integrated into seamless systems of governance. The question remains, why do we build monuments to Napoleon? Why do we name streets and institutions after a man whose policies produced millions of deaths, who systematically killed prisoners of war, who poisoned his own wounded troops, who burned villages as administrative procedure, who treated human lives as logistical variables to be optimized? Part of the answer is narrative control. Napoleon was brilliant at managing his own legacy. He carefully shaped the historical record. He promoted accounts that emphasized glory and minimized horror. He presented his atrocities as regrettable necessities forced on him by circumstances. And European society accepted these narratives, partly because they were comforting, partly because acknowledging the full scope of Napoleonic atrocity would have required acknowledging that the institutions celebrating Napoleon, military academies, government bureaucracies, legal systems were built on foundation of systematic violence. Easier to remember the victories, to celebrate the genius, to treat the horrors as aberrations rather than inherent features of the system. But there's a deeper reason Napoleon's legacy persists, because he succeeded in making atrocity rational, in building systems that could process mass killing without requiring individual moral culpability, in distributing responsibility so widely that no one felt fully accountable. This is enormously valuable to modern states. They need methods for managing populations through violence when necessary. They need bureaucratic structures that can implement policies their citizens would find morally repugnant if examined directly. They need the ability to say we were following procedures when confronted with atrocity. Napoleon provided the template. He demonstrated that systematic organization could make horror routine, that rational administration could produce mass death without requiring individual sadism, that the machinery itself could bear responsibility, allowing its human component to maintain clean consciences. This is why we build monuments, not despite the atrocities but because of them. Because Napoleon showed modern states how to make violence systematic, efficient, and morally diffuse enough that educated populations could participate without seeing themselves as murderers. The monuments are not historical errors, they are admissions, acknowledgements that we value the capacity for organized violence more than we value the lives it consumes. That we have built a civilization that requires the systematic infrastructure of killing that Napoleon perfected. That we are, all of us, components in machines that process human beings toward death with the same rational efficiency Napoleon's systems demonstrated. We build monuments to Napoleon because we are Napoleon's heirs, because we live in the world his systems created, because every modern state operates on principles he established, and because acknowledging this directly would require confronting questions we desperately wish to avoid. On April 7, 1803, the bodies were still being counted in Syria. 400 French soldiers who had trusted their general, who had followed him across deserts and through battles, who had believed the revolutionary promise that they were building something new, something better. They learned differently in the end, learned that systems built on rational efficiency eventually calculate, that some lives are not worth the logistical burden of saving, that promises of dignity and equality do not survive contact with strategic necessity, that the machinery they served would consume them as readily as it consumed enemies. The physicians who administered the poison at Jaffa returned to France and resumed practice. Most had successful careers. They trained students in the new rational medicine. They contributed to medical knowledge. They served their communities with apparent dedication. None were prosecuted. None were censured. Their participation in the killings was known but was treated as an unfortunate necessity of wartime service. Something regrettable but understandable. Something that should not overshadow their peacetime contributions to healing. This is how systems preserve themselves. Not by denying atrocity, but by contextualizing it. By explaining that difficult circumstances sometimes require difficult action. By suggesting that those who participated should not be judged too harshly because they were following orders, serving necessity, doing their duty in impossible situations. The explanations are rational. They are reasonable. They are designed to make continued participation in the system possible. Despite knowledge of what the system does, and they work, we continue building the systems, continue serving them, continue accepting their logic even when we know where that logic leads, because the alternative, acknowledging that the systems we serve are fundamentally built on organized violence, would require rebuilding everything. Our institutions, our governments, our understanding of what civilization means. We are not ready for that rebuilding. Perhaps we never will be, so we build monuments instead. We celebrate the genius while filing away the horror. We teach the victories in schools and leave the atrocities for specialists to study. We maintain the comfortable fiction that Napoleon was a great man who sometimes made difficult decisions rather than the architect of systematic atrocity that shaped modern state violence. And on April 7, in years when we remember at all, we might spare a thought for the 400 men who learned too late what enlightenment looks like when it calculates that your life is a logistical problem to be efficiently solved. The bodies were still being counted in Syria. The count never truly finished. We are counting them still. We will be counting them forever. Because Napoleon's system did not die with him. It evolved. It spread. It became the foundation of modern military organization, modern bureaucratic administration, modern state capacity to manage populations through rationalized violence. Every time we hear about acceptable losses, about collateral damage, about regrettable necessity, about difficult decisions made by serious people in impossible circumstances, every time we accept these explanations, every time we nod along with the logic, Every time we continue participating in systems we know produce horror, but tell ourselves we have no choice. We are standing in Jaffa, watching the physicians measure doses, telling ourselves this is mercy, this is necessity. This is what rational people do in difficult times, and the bodies continue accumulating in new places, under new names, processed by ever more sophisticated systems. But the logic remains Napoleon's. The infrastructure remains his gift to modernity, and the monuments remain, reminding us what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget.